right, welcome everyone I'd like to welcome everyone to our public forum, COP26, a left response, which has been organised by Socialist Alliance and Green Left. And just to give a brief introduction to myself, my name is Jacob Andrewarther, and I'm a member of Socialist Alliance, and I'll be chairing this meeting tonight. Now, I guess before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that, well, from the lands that I'm on right now, but there's this forum is being organised from Melbourne, also known as Naarm, which is the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people. I would like to pay my respect to their elders, past, present and emerging, and acknowledge that this land was stolen and never ceded, and that the struggle for justice for First Nations people in Australia is ongoing. And also probably acknowledge that, Aboriginal people will bear the brunt of the crisis that we kind of face with the climate. Now, just a bit of kind of things. This forum has been organised in response to the recent kind of COP26, the United Nations Climate Change Conference, which, in a sense, aimed to get countries' pledges to rapidly reduce carbon and methane emissions within the kind of next 10 years. Now, there has been quite a lot of commentary on this conference and what it actually represents for the climate movement, and then what we face. People aware that Greta Thunberg kind of described it as kind of like the festival of kind of blah, blah. And I guess at the same time, part of why we're sort of hosting this discussion is, by which this sort of meeting is kind of resigning, is within the COP26 conference, Australia has actually played a really appalling role that's even below the standards of what most Western capitalist countries are willing to do in terms of climate action. In fact, Scott Morrison's sort of recent announcements is that he's only really prepared to commit to net zero emissions by 2050, which basically means no change, kind of sinks to the status quo. And of course, we've written quite a lot of articles in Green Left, and I'd like to bring your attention to some of the articles that we've kind of written on this, on, undermine why this is kind of problematic. So that's why we've Green Left have kind of organised, and Socialist Alliance has kind of organised this kind of discussion, kind of response, trying to kind of bring people kind of together to, have a bit of a kind of left-wing kind of response to the COP26 conference. So for our forum tonight, we have around 2 speakers. We have John Molyneux, who's coming all the way, who's from Ireland, to speak to us today. He is a convener of Global Ecosocialist Network and a veteran socialist activist based in Ireland. And he was also involved in, he's also been part of the COP26 coalition, which is one of the groups that organised some of the protests that have taken place outside COP26. And they also organised their own sort of People's sort of summit counter kind of conference alongside as well, bringing together sort of grassroots activists and so on. And then we have Sarah Hathway, who is the national co-convenor of Socialist Alliance, who is going to be speaking. So the speakers are going to be each speaking for about 15 to 20 minutes or so. And then we'll open up the meeting to questions and discussion. I'll give the kind of housekeeping on how the discussion kind of will flow when the speakers kind of finish. So the first speaker I was going to sort of ask to kind of speak is John Molyneux, who I've just already given a bit of a brief introduction to. So I'll pass it on to John. So yeah.
Thank you very much, Jacob, and it's really great to be here. And able to speak to you. Good evening to you all. It's very much good morning from me, being early morning in Ireland. Following your custom of saying that you're speaking from unceded land, I think I should say I'm speaking from what was Britain's oldest and longest colony, and now no longer a British colony, but now a tax haven for the multinational corporations. Progress of a kind, maybe. Okay, and as I say, it's very, very good to see you all. It's I suppose the only one of the very few compensations of living in the pandemic is that we actually, through Zoom, talk to each other internationally much more. So that's great. I want to start, obviously, with the abject failure of COP26, even in its own terms. I expected, to be honest with you, that COP would at least engage in some serious greenwashing, and that in the aftermath of COP, one of the key tasks of the left would be to show how, what they claimed and what they were actually doing were quite different, that we would have to engage in a forensic dissection of what had come out of COP and look at the small print and so on. Actually, I don't think in the present circumstances that's even really necessary. Jacob quoted Greta Thunberg denouncing the conference while it was going on as blah, 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 which was, I think, very effective and very useful. We certainly made use of that on our demonstrations and so on in Ireland. But after the conference, she said they'd managed to even water down the blah, blah, blah. And that was quite an achievement. George Monbiot, the well-known environmental, I don't know if he's well-known in Australia, but he's well-known in Northwestern Europe. George Monbiot described as a suicide pact. And for us in Ireland, perhaps most telling was the statement by Mary Robinson. Mary Robinson is the former president of Ireland. She was the first woman president of Ireland. She then went on to be the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, the UN Special Envoy on Climate Change, and so on. She's a big noise establishment figure. And she said, she described COP26 as a shameful dereliction of duty on the part of our leaders, etc. I wouldn't quite put it like that, but given that these people are making this, it's you can gather that it was a total disaster. The only kind of claim that it makes is that it's the first to explicitly plan to reduce coal. Now that tells you something. They've had 26 COP conferences, and this is the first time they have even talked about reducing coal, and they've only talked about that. And remember, that was watered down, particularly through China and India, and so no doubt Australia played its own part in that. And so there's nothing definite there. They're just vaguely going to phase it down. They're pressing for more urgent measures, but that means nothing. They've been pressing for more urgent measures since 1992. There's no concrete commitments. The pledges that they are making are not enough to limit the warming of the planet to 1.5 degrees Celsius. There was, even if the pledges were implemented, they're still on course for more than 2 degrees. And of course, to say there is no guarantee the pledges will be implemented is too weak. I mean, it's almost certain that they won't be, because none of their other pledges have been implemented. And perhaps most telling of all, their declaration made no mention of the fossil fuel industry. But given that the single group organization or body that had the most number of delegates, more than any individual country, at the COP conference was the fossil fuel industry with over 500 delegates, this is hardly surprising. Okay, that's, so I think we can say, somebody put in the chat, COP out 26, yes, a complete COP out, a complete disaster. The key question, therefore, I think for the left, we have to address is why. Why was COP such a failure? And here, there, I think several arguments are quite important. It's tempting to see it, and a lot of the media puts it in this way, and sometimes they put Greta Thunberg's statements in this way and so on, see it as a generational issue. It's the old versus the young. I don't buy that. Partly because I'm 73, but I don't think that's the fundamental thing. I think there may be a difference in generational response to some extent, but that's not the root of the problem. It's certainly not ignorance. Our rulers have known for decades The first Earth Summit was in 1992, by the way. So it's not ignorance. Is it just not caring? Well, in a sense, you could say it's not caring, but why don't they care? And what actually are they doing? Sometimes people say to me, yeah, but don't they realize their children, their futures, are going to be destroyed? I think probably in their heads, what they're doing is saying we're going to gamble on technological advance, a sort of Elon Musk response. But that tells you something. That means they're willing to gamble the entire future of humanity on technology that still doesn't exist and that they can't be certain will exist. They'll put the whole future of humanity at risk for that. Just as in 1914, for example, they put the world's workers more than at risk. They sacrificed millions upon millions of the world's working people for wars. Now they'll gamble our whole future, and we have to name the problem. The problem, I think, quite clearly, is the commitment of all our rulers, or virtually all our rulers, to capitalism. To the capitalist economic system. And capitalism, by its very essence, subordinates people, the environment, and the planet to profit. Under capitalism, the tyranny of profit is, in the last analysis, absolute. We need to explain to people, I think, why this is. It's sometimes thought that capitalism is just about personal greed. It is not. It's much more than that. It is the fact that each capitalist unit is engaged week by week, month by month, year by year, in a competitive struggle, a struggle waged in terms of profits with its rivals, a struggle to accumulate capital. And that is of its very nature. That struggle goes on at the level of the two pharmacists down my road who are busy competing with one another. It goes on at the level of Woolworths and Coles in Australia. It goes on at the level of Microsoft and Dell, of ExxonMobil, BP and Shell. They are all fighting with their rivals for their share of the market, their share of production, and trying to produce more to achieve more and more profit. And crucially, and this is very important, we need to understand as well, that this goes on at the level of states. It is not just something restricted to the corporations with the states and the state apparatuses and the governments outside of this process. They're engaged in it as well. And you see that in terms of USA versus China versus the EU versus Russia and India, Australia and so on. They are all busily engaged in trying to ensure that USA Limited is keeping up with or maintaining its dominant position vis-a-vis China Limited and so on. So they are all caught up in this. And once we understand this clearly, then we can see there is not actually going to be a capitalist solution to the problem of climate change. The slogan that system change, not climate change, is literally true. That is what we need. We need a change to eco-socialism, the only real alternative to capitalism. Now, when we speak, therefore, about a left response to COP's failure, we should be speaking, I think, of an eco-socialist response, a response geared to assembling the forces that can bring about such climate change, such system change. That means we need to be organizing to take the power out of the hands of the Bezos and Musks, the billionaires, the corporations, and the politicians that represent them. Now, here, I don't just mean pressurize the government and corporations. I don't mean we shouldn't pressurize them. We were right to, or try to pressurize them. We were right to mobilize over COP. as we saw in Glasgow and many other places, because that brought millions or hundreds of thousands of people into action, and that was essential. We need to build a mass movement. It's part of the process of building a mass movement to overthrow the system. But ultimately, our goal is not just, I think, the hope that we can pressurize them into action. It has to be to go beyond that, to take power out of their hands. Now, I want to say just a little bit about the tactics in this specific situation. Obviously, these tactics will vary from country to country, and I don't know the situation well enough in Australia to say anything that's meant to be suggesting, what you should do or anything like that. Or in many places, that depends on the local situation, and it's very, very important that tactics are geared to specific situations. But I do think some general comments can be made. The first of these I want to make is that I think there is a pressure, because of the question of time deadlines that people feel, and a certain desperation, and I'll come back to that, but there is a pressure towards what I would call substitutionism. By substitutionism, I mean the idea that what's important is not a mass movement, but the heroic self-sacrificing actions of individuals. There's a long tradition of this in environmentalism. I mean, in a sense, Greenpeace was built on this. A few people would sail out into the seas, or a few people would scale buildings and so on. They had to be highly trained. There was no, it was a belief in action by a tiny minority of elite, dedicated people. And this will be there as well. It's a pressure that exists within Extinction Rebellion. The founder of Extinction Rebellion, Roger Hallam, who people may or may not know here, has very much gone in that direction. And even a well-known writer like Andreas Malm, who's made major contributions to eco-socialist thinking, is talking in those terms in his book, How to Blow Up a Pipeline. Now, I don't think we should go in that direction. I think that that direction is, we have to be a bit careful here, because of course some small actions by people will help build the movement, but we have to avoid actions that exclude people, or a strategy which excludes people, because mass mobilization is essential, both as the most effective way of pressurizing our particular governments and as a way of preparing for future change. So I don't want to be absolutist about this question of tactics, but I think strategically we have to retain a focus on the mass movement, and we have to see ourselves as reaching out to working class people, to the mass of the population in our respective countries. In this, I think the question of climate justice and of a just transition is vital. We should oppose carbon taxes and other measures that try to put the burden on working class people. And we should support, I think, demands that actually relate to the mass of people, and that they make life better for them. We shouldn't engage, I think, in the general ruling class rhetoric that we all have to tighten our belts and sacrifice, by which they mean working class people have to tighten their belts and sacrifice. They won't. So we should campaign for things like, I think, free public transport, retrofitting of homes and so on. Things that actually, as I say, make life better for working class people, a better life. I was in a big conference on Sunday, at which a question was raised: should we be dropping everything else and just focusing on climate change? It's an interesting question, because of course it is the overarching issue and the most urgent issue ultimately facing humanity. But I would say my answer to that would be no, we shouldn't. I think again, depending where you are, a multitude of issues that are important, and are important that we continue to be active on in order to have a chance of stopping climate change and changing the system. So questions like housing crisis and homelessness, racism, workers' struggles, land rights, women's rights, those sort of questions, multitude of them. I think we do have to be active on all of those as well, because in that way we can draw people into an understanding also of the climate crisis and the need to challenge the system. I would argue something like this, that we should try and embed commitment to climate justice in all the different movements and struggles. I'll give it just an analogy here. When we set up the Global Ecosocialist Network that myself and your member Susan Price here have been very much involved with, when we set this up, we put in our founding principles that we were against racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, and all forms of national oppression. Because we were going to campaign on all those things all the time? No, we are primarily focused on environmental questions and so on. But because we considered that you couldn't actually have a left progressive movement in the present day that wasn't anti-racist, anti-sexist, etc. You'd just immediately fracture and break. So you can't build a movement that isn't committed to those principles. I think we also want a situation, we want to move towards the situation where every progressive movement, every struggle also sees its place within fighting for climate justice. Now, within that movement, I think we need to, when I'm coming to a conclusion here, I think we need to make the case for system change. We need to say that means revolution. Of course, lots of people say system change and they mean different things by it. They mean that we need to change the system because we'll get our rulers to change their mindset. In Ireland, the Green Party believed this, and that's what they would always say. We need a mindset and a new economic model. And on that basis, they went into government, believing they could convert the conservative capitalist parties to a new mindset. Of course, this didn't happen. All that happened was they became complicit in running capitalism. So I don't mean that. I mean, we need an actual social revolution, a revolution from below by the mass of people. Now, there is an important argument against this. I just want to say something about that, which always comes up, but there's no time for that. We need change now. We can't wait for this revolution. Now, I'm not, of course, proposing that we wait for the revolution. We fight on everything right now. But I've heard this argument that we can't wait for your revolution for 20 years in the movement now. And I say we can't wait for capitalism to go green either. And I would also argue that it is not true that the process of greening capitalism is a quicker process than the process of revolution. In fact, we'll wait forever if we wait for capitalism to go green. And you have to remember that if revolutions do break out, they can spread like wildfire. And look at what happened with the Arab Spring. And I think if you had a social revolution, an eco-socialist revolution now, the inspiration would enable it to spread very, very rapidly. Two final points, and then I will conclude. The first is about politics and political parties. Again, I don't know the situation in Australia, but in much of the movement where I am, and in Britain and elsewhere, there is a kind of, we don't want political parties involved. I think it's a mistake. Partly because the process is inherently political. There has to be a political challenge to the system, including, I think, there has to be a challenge at the level of electoralism. We need to fight for eco-socialist politics in the electoral sphere and, in every other sphere. And I think political parties, precisely because they're active on a range of issues, can bring people together and play a vital role in the movement. So I think we have to argue against that. And the last thing I want to say is that our experience in Ireland is that using the term eco-socialist is very useful. It opens doors in the way that just using the old terminology about socialism doesn't, because it makes clear that you're taking the whole question of the whole question of the ecology and the environment absolutely central, that you understand that this has to be crucial to any notion of a socialist or sustainable future, and it cuts across a lot of the arguments from the past. So my conclusion is that the left response to COP26 has to be an eco-socialist response. And I would ask people here as well, if you're interested in this, you might be interested in the Global Ecosocialist Network, and I'll put a link to that in the chat. So thank you very much. Thank you, Jacob.
All right. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that, John. So yeah, I'm now going to introduce our next speaker, which is Sarah Hathway, National Co-convenor of Socialist Alliance, and is also organiser with VAPA. So pass it on to Sarah.
Hey comrades, yeah, too, just want to acknowledge that I'm joining you from Wadawurrung country and acknowledge that we're meeting on stolen land. Our Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, made Australia even more of a climate pariah at the United Nations Climate Change Conference, or COP26 in Glasgow. Subsequently, the media attempted to distract us immediately after with some confected outrage about Morrison's leaking of text messages between him and French President Emmanuel Macron around the cancellation of the submarine deal, as if that was like the most important thing or controversial thing that came out of COP26. The real disaster is the coalition's refusal to join one of the main actions coming out of that conference, which was a global pledge to cut methane emissions. The pledge had been announced at the UN General Assembly meeting in September. And over the course of COP26, the number of signatories increased from over 60 nations to more than 100. And that included countries like the United States, the European Union, and Brazil. Instead, Australia sided with China, Russia, India, and Iran, among other big methane emitters, by refusing to sign up. We also saw our Energy Minister, Angus Taylor, stating that the government had a whole of economy approach and it would not be setting any sector-specific targets. And his spurious response stems from the government's overwhelming focus on the exploration, mining, and export of gas. And this was very apparent at COP26, where we had the oil and gas company Santos hosted at our pavilion at the conference, apparently at the insistence of the Energy Minister. So our government's so-called plan for net zero emissions by 2050 includes no specific gas or industry targets and no new policies. And it relies on untested carbon capture and storage technology, all the while continuing to allow for a rise in fossil fuel emissions. And worse than a fringe dweller, Morrison was actively involved in undermining the G20 climate goals at the Rome summit before COP26, as well as leading the opposition to the 2030 methane emission reduction pledge. And he also successfully opposed plans to phase out coal power in advanced economies by 2030. Further, Morrison used his final comments to the summit to oppose the abolition of fossil fuels and instead demanded that the focus be on adaptation and empowerment. The G20 summit did not adopt a firm goal for net zero by 2050. Instead, it agreed to end public financing for coal power plants, but without any exact dates and with words implying the importance of reaching net zero by or around the middle of the century. It's clear that while other capitalist powers wanted to push a more climate-friendly image, they were also happy for Morrison to push his climate denier barrow, or, perhaps we've kind of progressed beyond climate denying to climate action delaying, I think is where we're at now. The United States President Joe Biden and Britain's Prime Minister Boris Johnson want to look good, something that Morrison helps them achieve without fundamentally challenging corporate fossil fuel interests. So despite finally signing on to the net zero 2050 target, the Australian government's target of a 26 to 28% reduction in carbon emissions compared to 2005 levels by 2030 lags behind other capitalist countries. The US is aiming to reduce emissions by at least 50%, and Britain is aiming for more than 60%. There's a widespread understanding and growing proof that renewable energies are reliable, they're cheaper than fossil fuels, and they create more jobs. Green capitalists, with the support of governments, are deploying them. However, their solution to the climate emergency will not come by waiting for the market to catch up. Climate activist Bill McKibben told ABC's 7:30 report on November 4 that the market will ultimately force a change away from fossil fuels. However, he said ultimately is not good enough for the crisis we're facing. Emissions from fossil fuel use in industry, transport, and mining have continued to rise, despite a temporary reduction at the start of the pandemic last year. Even if we could all change from gas-powered energy to solar rooftops, this does not change what McKibben described as the carbon and emissions being deeply embedded in the guts of the system. Rather than focusing on lifestyle change, the real job of individuals, he said, is to join together to force basic political and economic change that will rip carbon out of the guts of these systems. Most of the media coverage and advocacy at COP26 has been severely misinformed. We've seen politicians, business leaders, journalists, and NGO advocates talk about net zero 2050 and the 1.5 degrees Paris goal in the same breath and get away with it. It's been a gross underestimation of the climate condition and quite delusional, and very few seem to be calling it out. Net zero 2050 is a con. As Climate Code Red has reported, there's been a breakthrough report published in August this year. Central bankers have said that net zero by 2050 scenarios, central bankers have net zero 2050 scenarios in which fossil fuels still constitute 50% of our primary energy use in 2050. So when the Murdoch media endorses this net zero 2050 climate goal, we know it's a problem and not the answer. 2050 is so far away, it's just a reason for further procrastination. So judging by the G20 outcome, even net zero 2050 and a coal phase out, we saw they didn't pass muster at Glasgow. China is on a trajectory for net zero by 2060 and India for net zero by 2070. But 2050 is not the critical goal. 2025 and 2030 need to be the focus, and COP26 has not approached anything close of resembling what needs to be done. The models producing the 1.5 degree scenarios are not up to scratch, and the current climate models are not capturing all of the risk, including the stalling of the Gulf Stream, polar ice melt, and the uptick in extreme weather events. Carbon dioxide and methane release from deep permafrost are routinely not included in the climate modelling. Climate models do not account well for increased warming due to loss of Arctic sea ice. And the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC 2021 report, gives a best estimate of equilibrium climate sensitivity of 3 degrees Celsius, but including factors such as slow feedbacks or carbon stores and reflectivity changes, warming could be as high as 5 to 6 degrees for a doubling of carbon dioxide for a range of climate states between glacial conditions and an ice-free Antarctica. So beyond the make-believe of 1.5 degree scenarios full of overshoot, technological dreaming, high risks of failure, and not fully accounting for carbon cycle feedbacks, there are some basic realities. The first is that the world is likely to hit 1.5 degree average global warming by 2030, regardless of the emissions path over the next decade. We're already currently at 1.2, and the most recent IPCC reports show that current climate models project on average a warming of 0.3 degrees for the decade to 2030. Secondly, there is no carbon budget for a 1.5 degree target. It's a figment of modelers' imaginations. Renowned climate scientist and former head of climate at NASA, James Hansen, warned that the rate of global warming during the next 25 years could be double what it was in the previous 50. Rising emissions, declining aerosols, air pollution, and natural climate cycles will contribute to faster warming, as will greater stratification of the ocean with a hotter layer of water on top. So in September, the IPCC reported that global emissions will rise 16% by 2030, based on the 2010 levels, under government's plans put forward since the start of last year. At the opening of COP26, the British Prime Minister warned that we are at 1 minute to midnight on the doomsday clock. And at the G20 meeting, he warned that humanity, civilization, and society can go backwards as well as forwards. And when they start to go wrong, they can go wrong at extraordinary speed, and then referred to the Roman Empire. Professor Schallenhuber, director at the Potsdam Institute, is even more blunt. He stated, "I'm telling you that we're putting our kids onto a global school bus that will with 98% probability end in a deadly crash." Glasgow has not gotten within a mile of pledges to halve emissions by 2030, and any reputable climate scientist will say that means warming is going to shoot past 2 degrees warming. And then that gets us into the land of further accelerated warming. And why? Why have we not achieved anything at Glasgow? I think John's largely already outlined this, because capitalism isn't going to fix itself. It is inherently profit-driven, extractivist, and destructive. At this point, anyone who doesn't explicitly state this or tries to claim that we can vote or consume our way out of a climate crisis ranges somewhere between misinformed to a con artist or a snake oil salesman. This year, the United Nations Secretary General sounded the climate code red alarm as the IPCC report was released. If this change in rhetoric is to mean anything, it is this: forget about 2050, it's the next 5 years that matter. So despite Scott Morrison's post-Glasgow conversion to electric vehicles, Morrison stands exposed as a climate laggard. But our Labor opposition party is still walking down both sides of the street. Labor's climate spokesperson, Chris Bowen, gave a masterful demonstration of this on ABC. He's claimed that Labor and government will take methane seriously and that it has plans in place to reduce methane emissions by working cooperatively with industry and agriculture. He then argued against calling on the Morrison government to sign the international pledges to reduce methane emission and phase out coal. He's also justified gas exploration, including fracking in the Northern Territory, despite the International Energy Agency's call for zero new fossil fuel developments. Labor want to appear as if they have a climate action policy, while telling big business they will continue to support fossil fuel extraction. And this approach is completely at odds with what is needed to stay as close as possible to the 1.5 degree target and to give our species the best possible chance of avoiding an unlivable planet. The most important events at COP26 didn't occur inside, but in meetings and demonstrations outside. Some 100,000 people, mostly young people, marched for climate justice in Glasgow on November 26. And I just want to quickly share this image with you. Hopefully you can see that. Morrison, along with Murdoch, Putin, Trump, and Bolsonaro, were all correctly identified as climate criminals. However, it's not about the individuals, it's about the economic system of capitalism that is not broken. It's working as it was intended and will continue to drive us over the edge of a climate catastrophe. Just going to stop share. The lesson from the G20 and COP26 is that it's not enough to just change an extreme climate foot dragging government for a seemingly climate friendly, big talking but small action capitalist alternative. We need a people powered revolt against them both. We need less blah, 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 as Greta puts it. Politicians of one ilk or another are not going to save us. Neither is Elon Musk or Bezos by sending us into space. However, it might be helpful if they put themselves and the likes of Gina Reinhardt, Twiggy Forrest and Rupert Murdoch in a rocket directly into the sun. We need an eco-socialist alternative that puts people and the planet before profits. Thanks, comrades.
All right. So thank you very much for that, Sarah. Now, just a few kind of things. We're going to kind of begin kind of discussion kind of about.
Thanks everybody for joining this live stream of the COP26 Left Response Forum. If you are listening live, you can join in the rest of the Q&A on the Zoom link, which we'll put in the discussion shortly. Please, if you like our work, please become a Green Left supporter, and you'll find the details for that in the video description. Thanks everyone for joining us. We'll see you next time.